The photograph arrived at the Connecticut Historical Archive in a cardboard box labeled Hillcrest Academy, Miscellaneous Records 1908 to 1920 in January 2024. Dr. Margaret Chun, the archive specialist in early educational photography, was cataloging materials from the defunct private school when she pulled out a formal class portrait dated September 1910. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical school photograph from the era. 23 children stood arranged on the front steps of a brick building, positioned in 3 carefully organized rows. The girls wore high-collar white blouses and long dark skirts, their hair tied back with ribbons. The boys sported dark suits with white shirts, suspenders, and carefully combed hair slicked back with pomade. A stern-looking teacher, identified in faded ink on the back as Miss Eleanor Hartwell, stood at the far right, her hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl in the front row. Everything about the image conformed to conventions of early 20th century school photography. Formal poses, serious expressions, careful composition. The photographer had positioned the children to create a balanced, symmetrical arrangement. The building behind them showed the typical architecture of educational institutions from that period, with tall windows and ornate brickwork. Dr. Chin began the routine process of examining the photograph under magnification to check for damage and to better identify individual faces for cataloging purposes. She started with the front row, working her way systematically through each child, making notes about clothing, approximate ages, and any distinguishing features. When she reached the back row, she paused at the third child from the left, a boy who appeared to be about 10 or 11 years old. He stood between 2 other boys, his face turned slightly toward the camera, his expression neutral. Nothing about him seemed unusual at first, but as Dr. Chin studied his positioning more carefully, something caught her attention that made her adjust the magnification higher. The boy's legs didn't look quite right. She counted carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4. The boy in the back row had 4 legs. Dr. Chin blinked, certain she had miscounted or misinterpreted what she was seeing. She removed her glasses, cleaned them carefully, and looked again, but the image remained the same. The boy clearly had 4 legs visible beneath his dark trousers, 2 where his legs should naturally be, and 2 more positioned slightly behind and to the side, as if another person were standing directly behind him in exactly the same spot. She examined the photograph from different angles, checking for signs of double exposure or photographic manipulation. Early photography was prone to various technical errors. Double exposures where 2 images were accidentally superimposed, movement during the long exposure times that could create ghostly duplicates, or deliberate trick photography that was popular in the Victorian and Edwardian eras. But this didn't match any of those patterns. The rest of the photograph showed no signs of double exposure. All the other children were single, solid, properly exposed. There were no other ghostly figures or transparent overlays. Only this one boy showed the impossible anatomy of 4 legs. More disturbing still, the extra pair of legs didn't look ghostly or transparent. They were as solid and well-defined as the boy's primary legs. They cast shadows on the steps beneath them. The fabric of the trousers showed the same texture and detail. If this was a photographic error or deliberate trick, it was unlike anything Dr. Chin had encountered in 15 years of studying early photography. She began examining other aspects of the boy's image more carefully. His face seemed somehow different from the other children, though she couldn't immediately identify why. The features were clearer, sharper, as if he'd been closer to the camera even though he stood in the back row. There was something about the quality of light on his face that seemed inconsistent with the lighting on the children around him, and his feet didn't quite touch the step he was standing on. Dr. Chin zoomed in on the point where his shoes should make contact with the stone step. There was a tiny gap, barely perceptible, but definitely there. All 4 legs showed the same odd hovering quality, as if the boy were suspended a fraction of an inch above the surface. She checked for shadows. The other children cast clear shadows on the steps and on each other, where they stood close together. But the boy with 4 legs cast no shadow on the children beside him, even though he appeared to be standing at the same depth. It was as if he occupied the same physical space, but somehow didn't interact with the light in quite the same way. Dr. Chin pulled out the archives documentation about Hillcrest Academy. The school had operated from 1895 to 1942, serving children from wealthy families in Hartford and the surrounding area. The building had been demolished in 1955, and most of the school's records had been donated to the Historical Archive in the 1980s. She found enrollment records for the 1910 to 1911 school year. 23 students had been enrolled in the grade corresponding to the children in the photograph, which matched the number of children visible in the image. But the enrollment list included names without photographs, making it impossible to identify which child corresponded to which name. She searched for additional photographs from the same period, hoping to find other images that might help identify the boy. The archive contained several class photographs from Hillcrest Academy spanning different years. She examined each one carefully, looking for the same boy appearing in other images. In a photograph from 1909, she found what appeared to be the same child, positioned similarly in the back row. His face matched, his approximate height and build matched. But in the 1909 photograph, he had only 2 legs as expected. Nothing unusual or anomalous about his appearance at all. There was no photograph from 1911. The next school photograph in the archive dated from 1912, and the boy with 4 legs did not appear in it. Dr. Chin began searching through local newspapers from 1910, looking for any information about Hillcrest Academy or unusual events that might explain the photographic anomaly. She found routine society news, mentions of school performances, athletic competitions, graduation ceremonies. Nothing stood out as unusual. Then, in the Hartford Courant dated October 12, 1910, she found a brief obituary that made her stop cold. Thomas William Bradford, age 10, beloved son of William and Eleanor Bradford, died October 8, 1910, following a brief illness. Thomas was a student at Hillcrest Academy and will be remembered for his cheerful disposition and love of learning. Funeral services will be held at Trinity Episcopal Church. October 8, 1910. The school photograph had been taken in September 1910. According to the notation on the back, if this was Thomas Bradford in the photograph, he had died within weeks of when the image was captured. Dr. Chin searched for more information about Thomas Bradford. She found his death certificate in county records. Cause of death, pneumonia. Date of death, October 8, 1910. Age, 10 years, 5 months. She located the Bradford family plot in Cedar Hill Cemetery and found Thomas's grave. The small headstone confirmed the dates. Thomas William Bradford, 1900 to 1910. Gone too soon, forever in our hearts. But this didn't explain the 4 legs. Even if the boy in the photograph was Thomas Bradford, even if he had died shortly after the image was taken, that didn't account for the impossible anatomy visible in the photograph. Dr. Chin contacted Dr. James Kim, a forensic photograph analyst who specialized in authenticating and analyzing historical images. She sent him high-resolution scans of the photograph without explaining what she had found, wanting his independent assessment. Dr. Kim's report arrived 3 days later. "This is one of the most unusual historical photographs I have examined," he wrote. "The image shows clear signs of being a genuine period photograph with no evidence of modern digital manipulation. However, there are several anomalies that I cannot explain through standard photographic processes." He identified the same issues Dr. Chun had noticed. The 4 legs belonging to the boy in the back row, the unusual clarity and lighting of his face, the lack of proper shadows, the hovering quality of his feet. But he also found something Dr. Chun had missed. Under spectral analysis, the boy's image showed different properties from the rest of the photograph. "The spectral signature is different," Dr. Kim wrote. "It's as if this portion of the photograph was exposed under different lighting conditions or with different chemical processes. The boy's figure appears to emit a soft luminescence that is invisible to the naked eye but clearly detectable under spectral analysis." Dr. Kim concluded, "I have analyzed photographs for over 20 years. I have seen every type of double exposure, every form of early photographic manipulation, every kind of technical error that period cameras could produce. This matches none of them. I cannot provide a conventional explanation for what this photograph shows." Dr. Chin sat in her office, the photograph spread out under her examination lamp, and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. A boy who appeared in a school photograph taken in September 1910. A boy who died in October 1910. A boy whose image in a photograph showed impossible anatomy and properties that defied photographic explanation. And those four legs, solid and detailed, as if two versions of the same boy occupied the same space simultaneously. As if something about Thomas Bradford's presence in that photograph had been fundamentally different from the other children standing beside him. Dr. Chin decided to conduct more thorough research into Thomas Bradford's life and death. She contacted the Hartford Public Library and requested access to their local history archives, explaining that she was researching a Hillcrest Academy student from 1910. The librarian, Harold Morrison, was a local history enthusiast who had spent decades collecting information about Hartford families. When Dr. Chin mentioned Thomas Bradford, Harold's expression changed. "That's an interesting name to come across," he said carefully. The Bradford family was prominent in Hartford, but they left the city rather suddenly in late 1910. I've always wondered why. Harold pulled several boxes of materials related to the Bradford family. William Bradford had been a successful attorney with offices in downtown Hartford. Eleanor Bradford had been active in various charitable organizations. They had two children, Thomas, born in 1900, and a daughter, Margaret, born in 1903. The family had lived in a large Victorian house on Prospect Street, one of Hartford's most prestigious addresses. Contemporary newspaper accounts showed them attending social functions, hosting parties, participating in the life of the city's elite. By all accounts, they were a happy, successful family. Then, in October 1910, Thomas had fallen ill. The illness had progressed rapidly, and within days, he was dead. The funeral had been held at Trinity Episcopal Church, where the family were members. The obituary mentioned that Thomas had been a bright, cheerful child who was deeply mourned by his family and classmates. But Harold had found something else in his research. Just 2 months after Thomas's death, in December 1910, the Bradford family had sold their Prospect Street house and moved to Boston. William Bradford had closed his law practice in Hartford and established a new one in Massachusetts. The family had cut all ties with Hartford society, never returning even for visits. That kind of sudden departure was unusual, Harold explained. Wealthy families had deep roots in the community. They didn't just abandon established social positions and professional practices without serious reason. I've always suspected there was more to the story than simple grief over their son's death. Dr. Chin showed Harold a photograph. She pointed out the boy in the back row and explained the anomalies she had discovered. Harold studied the image carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Look at his positioning," Harold said after several minutes. "He's standing between these two other boys. But there's something about the spacing that's wrong. It's as if the boys on either side are leaving more room than necessary, as if they're unconsciously avoiding standing too close to him." Dr. Chin looked more carefully and realized Harold was right. The children throughout the photograph stood quite close together, shoulders touching in some cases. But the boys flanking Thomas Bradford maintained a gap of several inches on either side. Their posture suggested subtle leaning away, creating negative space around the boy with 4 legs. Harold made another observation. "Look at the children's eyes," he said. "Most of them are looking directly at the camera, as you would expect. But several of them, especially those in the back row near this boy, their eyes are shifted slightly. They're not looking at the camera. They're looking at him." It was true. The girl directly in front of Thomas Bradford had her eyes tilted upward, her gaze directed over the camera toward the boy behind her. One of the boys in his row had his head turned fractionally, his peripheral vision clearly focused on Thomas rather than the photographer. Even the teacher, Miss Hartwell, had her gaze directed not at the camera, but toward the back row, her expression difficult to read, but definitely not the neutral professional demeanor typical of period school photographs. Dr. Chin and Harold spent the next week researching together, combining Dr. Chin's expertise in historical photography with Harold's knowledge of Hartford history. They searched through school records, newspaper archives, cemetery documentation, and personal papers of families connected to Hillcrest Academy. They found Miss Eleanor Hartwell's employment records. She had taught at Hillcrest Academy from 1905 to 1911. Her contract had not been renewed after the 1910 to 1911 school year, Unusual for a teacher who had apparently been successful and well-regarded. She had left Hartford and taken a teaching position at a school in Vermont. Dr. Chin located Miss Hartwell's obituary. She had died in 1958 at age 76. Among her papers, donated to a Vermont Historical Society, Dr. Chin found a diary covering her years teaching in Hartford. The entry for September 15, 1910, described the day the school photograph was taken. We assembled the children on the front steps for the annual class portrait. Miss Hartwell had written, "It should have been a routine affair, but I found myself deeply unsettled by Thomas Bradford's presence. The boy has been acting strangely since returning to school this autumn. He is distant, almost absent, even when he appears to be paying attention. Several of the other children have complained that he frightens them, though they cannot articulate why." The entry continued. "During the photograph, I positioned myself where I could keep watch over the children, but particularly over Thomas. There was something wrong about how he stood there, something I could not define, but felt deeply. When the photographer called for everyone to hold still, I saw Thomas's shadow on the step, but it was wrong. The shadow did not match his posture. It seemed to show two boys standing in the same space, overlapping, as if Thomas were somehow doubled." Dr. Chin read the passage several times. Miss Hartwell had seen something wrong during the actual photograph, before the image was even developed. She had observed an anomalous shadow that suggested the same doubling that appeared in the final photograph. The diary entries from the following weeks documented Miss Hartwell's growing concern about Thomas. She described him as increasingly withdrawn, responding to questions with delayed reactions, appearing to not fully inhabit his physical presence. Other children had begun avoiding him, and several parents had complained that their children were having nightmares about Thomas. The entry for October 9, 1910, the day after Thomas's death, was brief and disturbing. "Thomas Bradford died yesterday," Miss Hartwell wrote. "I should feel sorrow, but instead I feel a terrible relief. There was something profoundly wrong with that child in his final weeks. I do not believe the pneumonia killed him. I believe he was already gone, and his body simply took time to acknowledge what his spirit had already completed." Dr. Chun found another crucial document, a letter from William Bradford to the headmaster of Hillcrest Academy, dated November 1910. In it, Bradford demanded the return of the school photograph taken in September. He claimed that his son's image in the photograph was disturbing and inappropriate, and insisted that all copies be destroyed. The headmaster's response, preserved in the school's records, politely refused. The photograph was school property, he wrote, and while he sympathized with Bradford's grief, he could not destroy an official school record. However, he agreed not to display the photograph publicly out of respect for the family's feelings. This explained why the photograph had remained in the archives collection rather than being displayed or reproduced. It had been deliberately kept out of public view for over a century. Harold discovered one more piece of the puzzle. He found a letter written by Thomas's sister Margaret in 1975, shortly before her death. The letter, addressed to a niece, reflected on her brother's death 65 years earlier. "I was only 7 when Thomas died," Margaret wrote, "but I remember that something was terribly wrong with him in the weeks before his death. He had always been my beloved older brother, playful and kind, but after we returned from our summer holiday in August 1910, he was different. He was quiet, distant, as if he were somewhere else even when he sat beside me." She continued, "I remember one evening asking him what was wrong. He looked at me with eyes that seemed empty, hollow, and he said something I never forgot. I met someone this summer, Maggie, someone who showed me what comes next, and now I'm waiting to go there. I didn't understand what he meant, and when I told Mother, she dismissed it as childish imagination. But I knew Thomas was telling me something important, something terrible." Margaret described how Thomas had grown physically weaker over the following weeks, though doctors could find nothing wrong with him. He ate, slept, attended school, but seemed to be fading, becoming less present each day. When the pneumonia struck in early October, it had killed him within 3 days, as if his body had been waiting for permission to stop. "Mother and Father never spoke of it after we moved to Boston," Margaret wrote, "but I know they saw it too. Something had happened to Thomas that summer. Something had taken part of him away. leaving behind a shell that grew emptier each day until there was nothing left to sustain life. The boy who came back from that holiday was not entirely my brother. He was something else, something in between, and I believe that school photographs somehow captured what he had become. Dr. Chin tried to trace what had happened during the Bradford family's summer holiday in 1910. She found references in Eleanor Bradford's diary, which had been donated to a historical society in Boston. The family had spent August at a cottage they rented on the Connecticut shore. Eleanor's diary entries from that month were initially routine, pleasant days at the beach, sailing, reading time with the children. But on August 18th, the tone changed dramatically. "Thomas went missing this afternoon for nearly 4 hours," Eleanor wrote. "We searched frantically, calling his name along the beach and through the nearby woods. We were about to contact authorities when he simply appeared at the cottage door, wet and muddy, with no explanation of where he had been." The entry continued. "He claims he was exploring cave along the shore and lost track of time. But his demeanor is strange, altered. He speaks in a flat, distant voice. His eyes seem unfocused, as if he is looking at something we cannot see. William examined him for injuries and found none, but we are both deeply unsettled. Something happened to our son during those missing hours, something he either cannot or will not explain." The diary entries from the remaining days of August documented the family's growing concern as Thomas's behavior became increasingly unusual. He would stand at windows staring at nothing for hours. He would wake in the night and wander through the cottage. He spoke very little, and when he did, his words were often cryptic references to going soon and the place I was shown. Dr. Chin organized an exhibition at the Connecticut Historical Archive in March 2024 titled "The Impossible Photograph: Mystery and Mortality in Early 20th Century Education." The 1910 Hillcrest Academy photograph served as a centerpiece, displayed alongside the documentation she and Harold had uncovered about Thomas Bradford. The exhibition explored the photograph from multiple angles, as a technical anomaly, as a historical document, and as a window into early 20th century beliefs about deaf childhood and the supernatural. Dr. Chin was careful to present the facts without imposing a single interpretation, allowing visitors to draw their own conclusions about what the image showed and meant. Display cases contained Miss Hartwell's diary entries, Margaret Bradford's letter, Eleanor Bradford's diary, and the correspondence between William Bradford and the school headmaster. Large format prints showed the photograph at various magnifications, clearly displaying the forelegs and other anomalies. Dr. Kim's spectroanalysis images were mounted beside the original photograph, showing a luminescence invisible to normal vision. One section of the exhibition provided historical context about Victorian and Edwardian attitudes toward death and photography. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, spirit photography and postmortem photography were common practices. Families often photographed deceased loved ones, especially children, as a way of preserving their memory. Some photographers claimed to capture images of spirits or ghosts appearing alongside living subjects. But the Hillcrest photograph didn't fit neatly into either category. It wasn't a deliberate post-mortem portrait. Thomas was still alive when the image was taken. It didn't appear to be spirit photography. There was no transparent or ethereal quality to suggest a ghostly presence. Instead, it showed something more disturbing. A living child whose image in a photograph revealed that something fundamental was wrong, that he was somehow doubled or divided, that his presence was not entirely singular or coherent. Dr. Chin included information about similar anomalous photographs from the period. She had found several other school photographs from different locations dating between 1908 and 1915 that showed similar oddities. Children whose images displayed extra limbs, unusual luminescence, or other impossible features. In each case, she had been able to trace the child to death records, showing they had died within weeks or months of when the photograph was taken. The pattern suggested something deeply unsettling. It was as if the photographic process, with its precise chemical recording of light and shadow, could sometimes detect changes in a person that were not yet visible to normal perception, as if the camera could see that someone was in transition between life and death before that transition became obvious to human observers. The exhibition attracted significant media attention and thousands of visitors. Many came specifically to see the photograph with 4 legs, to study the anomalies themselves, to try to understand what they were witnessing. The image had a profound effect on viewers, who often stood before it in silence, trying to reconcile the impossible anatomy with the ordinary school setting. Online discussions about the photograph spread rapidly across social media. Skeptics argued it must be a hoax or photographic error, despite Dr. Kim's analysis proving it was a genuine period photograph with no evidence of manipulation. Believers saw it as proof of supernatural phenomena, evidence that cameras could capture aspects of reality invisible to human eyes. Some viewers found it deeply disturbing, reporting nightmares after seeing the image. Dr. Chin gave regular talks during the exhibition period, discussing the photograph and the research behind understanding it. She emphasized that she was not claiming to have definitive answers. "I am a historian and archivist, not a paranormal investigator," she told one audience. "My role is to document what we know, present the evidence we have, and acknowledge what remains unexplained. This photograph exists. It shows what it shows. Multiple experts have analyzed it and confirmed it is a genuine period photograph. The boy in the image appears to have 4 legs, and he died within weeks of when this photograph was taken. Those are facts. What they mean is for each person to decide." Several visitors claimed to have personal experiences with similar phenomena. An elderly woman explained that her grandmother had spoken of a cousin who appeared wrong in a family photograph taken shortly before the cousin's death in 1918. A man brought in a photograph from 1923 that showed his great-uncle with what appeared to be a shadowy double standing behind him. The great-uncle had died in a car accident 2 weeks after the photograph was taken. Dr. Chin began collecting these accounts and similar photographs, building an archive of what she termed premonitory photography, images that seemed to show signs of impending death before it occurred. The collection grew to include dozens of examples spanning from the 1880s to the 1950s, when photographic technology began to change in ways that seemed to eliminate the phenomenon. One of the most moving moments during the exhibition came when a descendant of the Bradford family contacted Dr. Chun. The woman, Catherine Bradford Winters, was Thomas Bradford's great-grandniece. She was 72 years old and had grown up hearing family stories about poor Thomas who died so young. "I never knew there was anything unusual about his death beyond his young age," Catherine told Dr. Chun when she visited the exhibition. "My grandmother was Margaret, Thomas's sister. She died when I was 16, but I remember her well. She would sometimes grow very quiet and distant, and when I asked why, she would say she was thinking about her brother Thomas. She said he had been special, that he had seen things other people couldn't see. I thought she just meant he was imaginative. Now I wonder if she meant something more literal." Catherine shared additional family materials with Dr. Chun. Among them was a small watercolor painting that Thomas had created in early September 1910, just weeks before his death and days before the school photograph was taken. The painting showed a figure that appeared to be Thomas himself, but rendered as 2 overlapping silhouettes, one slightly transparent and shifted off-center from the other. Underneath, in a child's careful handwriting, was a caption, "This is what I look like now." "My grandmother kept this painting her entire life," Catherine explained. "She never displayed it or showed it to people. She kept it wrapped in cloth in a drawer. A few weeks before she died, she showed it to me and told me to keep it safe, that someday someone might want to understand what had happened to Thomas. I think she would be glad to know you're trying to understand, even if we can never fully explain it." The painting was added to the exhibition, displayed beside the photograph. Visitors were struck by how the child's artwork seemed to depict the same doubling that the camera had captured. It suggested that Thomas himself had been aware of what was happening to him, that he had perceived his own division or transition in some way. Dr. Chun included a section in the exhibition addressing the broader question of what photography reveals about reality. "We tend to think of photographs as simple records of what exists," the display text explained. "We say the camera doesn't lie. But perhaps the camera sees things we don't. Perhaps it records wavelengths of light, shadows, reflections, and relationships that our eyes edit out or our brains refuse to process. Perhaps some photographs show us not just what is, but what is becoming or what is ending. This photograph may be one of those rare instances where the camera recorded a truth that was invisible to the people present when the image was captured." The exhibition ran for 9 months, attracting over 100,000 visitors. It generated enough interest that the Connecticut Historical Archive created a permanent display on anomalous historical photographs, including the Hillcrest image and others from Dr. Chen's growing collection. The photograph has been digitized and made available online, though many viewers report finding the image disturbing to look at for extended periods. Several academic papers have been published analyzing the photograph from various perspectives. Historians of photography have studied it as an example of early photographic anomalies. Scholars of death studies have examined it in the context of early 20th century mortality and mourning practices. Paranormal researchers have included it in studies of premonitory phenomena. None have provided definitive explanations, but all have contributed to deeper understanding of the image's context and significance. For Dr. Chun, the photograph remains both a historical document and an ongoing mystery. I have spent over a year researching this single image, she reflected in the exhibition catalog. I have traced the life and death of Thomas Bradford. I have read the account of people who knew him, who taught him, who photographed him. I have examined the photograph under every form of analysis available to modern technology, and I still cannot tell you with certainty what it shows or why. She continued, but I can tell you what it meant to the people who knew Thomas. His teacher saw him as a child who was slipping away, becoming less present even as he stood before her. His sister remembered him as someone who had seen what comes after life, and was waiting to go there. His parents were so disturbed by his image in this photograph that they demanded its destruction and fled the city where their son had died. And Thomas himself apparently perceived that he was divided, doubled, caught between states of being. The photograph captured all of that somehow. It made visible what they had sensed but couldn't fully see. The photograph remains in the Connecticut Historical Archive's permanent collection, preserved and protected, but also accessible to researchers and the public. It continues to generate discussion, analysis, and debate more than a century after it was taken. And it continues to unsettle viewers who count the legs of the boy in the back row and find 4 instead of 2, who see the luminescence in his face that shouldn't be there, who recognize that something impossible was captured in silver halide emulsion on a September day in 1910. The boy's name was Thomas William Bradford. He lived for 10 years and 5 months. And in his final weeks of life, a camera saw what his family and teachers had sensed but couldn't articulate, that he was somehow doubled, divided, already partially departed, even as he stood among his classmates for a school photograph. The image preserves an impossible truth, raising questions about perception, death, and the nature of photography that remain unanswered to this day.